much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here. So I wanted to begin by telling you all the story of my garden in Portland. And it is the story of, let's see, make sure this works, of how my partner Ryan and I turned this into this. And I have loved gardening since childhood, but for most of my adult life, I never really had the space or the opportunity to garden seriously. And that changed about 4 years ago when Ryan and I bought a house here in North Portland. And our property had an unusually deep south-facing lot that at the time was covered with nothing more than this neglected turf grass lawn. And that was exciting to us because it was a blank canvas that we could use to create our dream garden from scratch. So we hired a contractor to come in and rip out all the grass. And we quickly discovered that our soil was in really bad shape. Not only was it clay heavy, like so much of our soil here in Portland is, but it was full of rubble and debris and gravel. It was extremely hard and unyielding. And laboratory tests showed me that it was depleted of nitrogen and other essential nutrients. And in the past, I had only gardened in relatively small spaces, like modestly sized raised beds or even just containers. And so to solve a problem like this, I would just go to the local nursery and buy a few bags of compost and high quality soil, and it wasn't really a big deal. But now I had this much vaster space to cultivate, and replacing all the soil within it was simply not feasible. So I decided to start learning a lot more about soil science, partly to better understand what to do about this situation. And what I discovered is that I'd really been thinking about soil incorrectly my whole life, because I'd always thought of soil as a kind of earthly fabric that can be conditioned and reconditioned, or a repository for nutrients that can be depleted and replenished over and over again. But there's growing recognition, even in mainstream scientific circles, that soil is not simply a substrate or a medium for life, but is alive itself. Soil is a dynamic living network made of air, water, rock, and creature. And it's really the connections between those elements that create and maintain soil as we know it. And so even some mainstream textbooks and renowned scientists are now very comfortable speaking of soils as living systems that operate in a self-regulating way and maintain a dynamic equilibrium. And soil, as we know it, is really a very recent development in the history of our planet. Because for most of Earth's 4.5 billion year history, it didn't really have the kind of soil that we know today. It had something more like the crumbled rock that you might find on Mars. And the rich, fertile soils that we have now are a product of billions of years of the elements of weathering rock, breaking it down, and then hundreds of millions of years of further interactions with complex life forms. And it's really microbes, plants, fungi, and animals that enrich that broken down rock with the organic compounds that constitute and maintain the fertile soils on which we depend to grow crops and feed ourselves. So based on what I'd learned about soil science, I decided that the single best change we could make in our garden was to introduce a large number of diverse and healthy plants to this emaciated landscape. Because when you do that, the plants themselves immediately begin several crucial processes. They permeate the soil with their roots, opening channels for air, water, and nutrients. They attract their symbiotic partners, the microbes, fungi, and eventually animals with which they co-evolved, and which collectively form the foundation of any soil ecosystem. And they eventually cover the soil with a protective cloak of vegetation, which reduces erosion and prevents soil's unique architecture and structure from being destroyed by the elements. So we brought in all these plants. Some came from our previous home, many came from local nurseries. And We also, at the same time, started to apply some of the basic principles of regenerative agriculture and wildlife gardening. For example, we built a compost bin so that we could start composting. We installed drip irrigation to reduce erosion. We allowed vegetation to rot and decay in place. And we started mulching in the spring and fall. And perhaps most importantly, we planted literally hundreds of different cultivars of plants, so many that we had to start a register just to keep track of them all. And we focused on hardy, drought-tolerant perennials, including many natives. And we really wanted to kind of, some of our friends joke that it's kind of like walking through a miniature botanical garden because there's just so many different types of plants stuffed in there. And it's really hard for me to resist trying out new things. And I'm always trying to discover the sort of microclimates within the garden and, figure out what works best in what location. And so even within a few seasons, not even a full year, those plants rapidly expanded and really began to transform the landscape. But the landscape was transforming not only botanically, the soil was changing too. It was becoming darker and richer and looser, easier to work. And further laboratory tests showed that that soil was increasing in its nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium levels. Um, and we also put in a pond and a bog because they are particularly good resources for wildlife. And so this picture is from 2 years after we began this transformation. And this is kind of the peak summer bloom in the rockery, the rock garden area. And I took a similar approach in the front yard. I ripped out all the grass and shrubs by hand this time with a pickaxe and shovel. And then I scattered a curated mix of wildflower seeds. And within a year, we had the beginnings of a wildflower meadow. And then I have continually diversified this meadow by introducing new cultivars of both flowering annuals and perennials, both to provide more resources for wildlife over a longer period of time, but also to increase the bloom sequence, to extend it, and just to make it more beautiful. And this meadow in our front yard has really become a fixture of the neighborhood. And it's inspired several of our neighbors to do something similar, to rip out their turf grass, which they really weren't using for anything, and to put in flowering plants instead and provide a lot more resources for wildlife and a lot more beauty for their fellow neighbors. And here is an aerial view from exactly the same vantage point on the second story. So you can kind of see just how much the garden has filled out and changed in the past 4 years. And this garden is now incredibly much more biodiverse than what was there before, and it is also storing a lot more carbon than it was before. And one of the great joys of this transformation has been observing all of the wildlife that the garden has brought in. Because when we first moved to this property, the only thing we saw outdoors was the occasional spider crawling through crispy turf grass. There really wasn't much reason for animals to visit. But we now have this wide array of insects and other arthropods, of birds, and even mammals, a family of mischievous raccoons that frequents the ponds, jumping mice that nest in the compost bin, songbirds, hummingbirds, and even birds of prey, raptors and falcons, and all sorts of native bees, several species of which have chosen to nest in the garden, which really excited me. The leafcutter bees and some native orange-rumped bumblebees as well. So at the same time that I was going through this gardening journey, I was writing this book, Becoming Earth. And this book offers a new way of thinking about our planet, not simply as a planet with life on it, but rather as a planet that came to life. And my book explores how life has transformed the planet over several billion years. And it re-examines this provocative idea that Earth itself is alive. And the more that I worked on my book and my garden simultaneously, the more parallels I discovered between the two. And eventually, that gardening journey I just told you became the narrative framework for one of the chapters, which focuses on the history and the future of Earth's soils. And as it happens, the seeds for this entire book were planted in a garden of sorts, a much larger garden, the largest forest on our planet, the Amazon rainforest. Because many years ago, I learned an astonishing fact, which is that the Amazon rainforest does not simply receive the rain on which it depends. The Amazon summons about half of the rain that falls on its canopy each year. It generates that rain itself. And the way in which this happens is extremely fascinating. So rain clouds need two essential ingredients to form. They need water vapor and they need lots of tiny airborne particles suspended in the air on which that vapor can condense. And the Amazon is continually providing both. It's pulling huge volumes of water from the soil and releasing what it doesn't use to the atmosphere. And at the same time, it's spewing invisible plumes of tiny biological particles, which look like this: pollen grains, fungal spores, microbes, bits and pieces of insect shells, and fragments of leaves and bark. And these are actual microscopic bioaerosols, as they're known, that scientists collected above the Amazon rainforest. And the wind sweeps these bioaerosols into the atmosphere, where they combine with the water vapor and dramatically accelerate cloud formation. And some of these particles even become the seeds for ice crystals within clouds, which makes them heavier and more likely to burst. But the massive flying river of water and biology discharged by the Amazon does not stay in place. It actually travels throughout South America, bringing precipitation to other parts of the continent, including regions that would otherwise dry out. And through long-range atmospheric ripple effects, the Amazon is even influencing weather as far away as Canada and right here in the Pacific Northwest. So a tree growing in Brazil can change the weather all the way in Manitoba. Now, learning to see the Amazon this way was a revelatory experience for me. And the idea of the Amazon rainforest as a kind of garden that watered itself began to obsess me. Because I'd always been taught that life is subject to its environment, not the other way around. And indeed, that is the perspective that Western science has historically emphasized. Even some of our greatest scientific luminaries have espoused this view. Rachel Carson and E.O. Wilson have both written that life's influence on the planet has been relatively slight. But learning that the Amazon conjured rain and changed weather around the globe made me question that conventional wisdom. And I started to wonder how else life dramatically alters its environment, not just locally, but on the scale of a continent, an ocean, or even the entire planet. I was asking myself, how has life shaped Earth? And answering that question eventually took me around the globe. I traveled to a remote experimental nature park in Siberia, where Russian scientists are introducing large grazing animals to re-engineer the landscape and recreate some version of the ancient grasslands that existed there tens of thousands of years ago in the Pleistocene. I descended close to a mile beneath the surface of the planet in a former gold mine where scientists hunt for bizarre rock-breathing microbes that inhabit and transfigure the planet's deep crust. And I eventually climbed this tower in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, which functions as a scientific observatory literally halfway between the trees and clouds and is the tallest structure in all of South America. And what I learned is that contrary to those long-standing maxims, life has been a formidable geophysical force throughout the planet's history. Microbes, plants, animals, and fungi have radically altered the continent's atmosphere and oceans, turning what was once just a lump of orbiting rock into our cosmic oasis. If we traveled more than 4 billion years into the past, we would hardly recognize our planet. Ancient Earth probably had a hazy orange atmosphere with essentially no free oxygen, and a vast ocean dotted with volcanic islands but lacking substantial land masses. Life was integral to the transformations that made the planet we know today. For example, 2.5 billion years ago, photosynthetic ocean microbes known as cyanobacteria began to oxygenate the atmosphere, a permanent shift that was later reinforced by land plants. And in doing so, they dyed the sky blue, formed the ozone layer, and made fire possible for the first time. Marine plankton emit gases that increase cloud cover and accumulate in layers of deep sea sediments that buffer ocean acidification. Microorganisms participate in numerous geological processes. They carve vast caverns and concentrate precious metals, and they're responsible for much of Earth's mineral diversity. And some scientists think they even played a crucial role in the formation of the continents by eating away at and lubricating ancient basalt and facilitating its subduction and transformation into the granite that forms the continental land masses. And then animals as diverse as prairie dogs, elephants, and termites continually reconstruct the planet's land surfaces, improving the circulation of air, water, and nutrients. And as we've seen, all manner of life forms collectively converted the planet's once barren crust into fertile soil. So life is really responsible for many of the fundamental features of the planet, those that we take for granted or assume were the default state. But life does more than just modify the planet's structure and chemistry. It is also entwined with the planet's capacity to regulate itself. And this is one of the prime examples. It's known as the planetary thermostat, or the carbonate silicate cycle. And I won't bog us down with too many of the technical details right now, but the gist is that together, Earth and life, geology and biology, have co-evolved an elaborate process of self-regulation through which they can drag the climate back to a more stable state when it enters an extreme hothouse state or a deep freeze. So studying these kinds of intimate connections between geology and biology brought me to one of the most provocative ideas in the history of Western science, the Gaia hypothesis. Proposed by James Lovelock in the 1960s and later developed with Lynn Margulis, the Gaia hypothesis proposes that wherever life emerges, it inevitably transforms its home planet, and that together, Earth and life form a single, highly interconnected, living entity. And one of Lovelock's favorite metaphors for Gaia was a giant redwood tree, because the majority of any mature tree is actually dead wood, which is just laced and ringed with thin strips of living tissue. Well, Lovelock argued, just as those thin strips of living tissue are essential to keep a whole tree alive, Earth's thin, flowering, living skin helps sustain a kind of global being. And while that type of idea was immensely popular with the general public, his ideas were initially harshly criticized by the scientific community. And that's partially because, by his own admission, Lovelock made some mistakes in his initial articulations of Gaia. He initially gave the impression that all organisms on the planet were explicitly cooperating for the purpose of keeping the planet habitable. And that kind of teleology, that notion of working towards a goal, contradicted mainstream evolutionary biology. But over time, Lovelock and Margulis refined their ideas and clarified that what they were describing did not require any teleology or intention, because they were talking about an emergent phenomenon resulting from inevitable physical interactions between Earth and life. And Gaia was their name for that emergent phenomenon. Today, it is universally accepted within science that Earth and life continually co-evolve, each changing the other. That together, life and the planet form a single, highly interconnected system. And that life has been a major geophysical force for at least 3.5 billion years, if not longer. And many scientists further acknowledge that life is integral to the planet's self-regulating processes. And these kinds of ideas have become the pillars of a relatively new mainstream field called Earth system science. Now, scientists used to think that the evolution of life was a parallel but separate process to the changes that the planet underwent. But as Earth system scientist Tim Lenton has written, he and his colleagues now think in terms of a single integrated co-evolutionary process. They think of the evolution of life and the evolution of Earth happening together as one. And to me, that represented a substantial revision to the modern understanding of evolution and life, but one that not really seeped into public consciousness. It hadn't really had its moment in the spotlight. It wasn't as familiar to people as the selfish gene or the microbiome or black holes. And that's a large part of why I wanted to write a book about this. And I discovered in my interviews that many scientists, ranging from atmosphere to chemists to astrobiologists to paleontologists and geologists, either embrace the notion of a living planet or are increasingly open to it. Some of them told me that for them to say Earth is alive is a plain statement of fact. And astrobiologist David Grinspoon has written that Earth is not simply a planet with life on it, but is a living planet, an explicit animate entity. And even some of Gaia's strongest original critics have changed their mind, such as the renowned evolutionary biologist W. Doolittle. He has written publicly and recently that he is warm to the idea of Gaia, and he is now engaged in a project that he calls Darwinizing Gaia, trying to reconcile it with modern evolutionary theory. Now, claiming Earth is alive remains provocative, and many people who oppose this idea make the same types of objections. Earth cannot be alive, they say, because it does not eat or grow or reproduce or evolve through natural selection like real living things. But the problem is that there's never really been an objective measure nor a consensus definition of life. Textbooks continue to offer us long lists of qualities that presumably distinguish the animate from the inanimate. But the two cannot be categorically separated. Many things we consider inanimate have fundamental features of the living, and vice versa. Fire, for example, consumes fuel as it grows, and crystals faithfully replicate their highly organized structures as they expand, yet most of us do not think of either as alive. Conversely, some organisms like tardigrades and brine shrimp can enter a period of extreme dormancy during which they stop eating, growing, or changing in any way, yet are still considered to be living organisms. Life then is more of a spectrum than a category. Life is more of a verb than a noun. Life is not a discrete class of matter, nor a distinct property of matter, but rather a process, a performance. Life is something matter does. Living systems do something to keep themselves alive. Thermodynamics suggests that the universe is moving inescapably towards a state of maximum entropy, which means that eventually everything must fall apart, dissolving into a homogeneous mush. But living systems temporarily evade that fate by using available energy to reduce their internal entropy and maintain what would otherwise be an improbable degree of organization and complexity. And theoretically, any system of matter with sufficient complexity and an adequate supply of energy can participate in the phenomenon we call life. So we need to become more comfortable with the idea that life happens at multiple scales, the scale of the cell, the organism, the ecosystem, and even the planet. And I've come to see life not as something that simply resides on or inhabits the planet, but rather as a physical extension of the planet. And I like to make an analogy to a vast beach from which spontaneously emerge all manner of intricate sand sculptures. Just because these structures have attained a new level of complexity and organization does not mean they're suddenly divorced from the beach. They're still made of the same grains of sand that surround them. They are still literally the beach. And I think it's exactly the same with Earth and life. Life emerged from and is made of Earth. What we call life is Earth, animated. And because life is so ubiquitous across the planet, it endows Earth with a planetary scale anatomy and physiology, dramatically increasing by hundreds of thousands of times the surface area of the planet that is capable of absorbing and transforming energy, exchanging gases, and performing complex chemical reactions. I've come to see all the organisms on the planet as Earth's own living tissues, and their collective activity as the planet's metabolism and physiology. So, tying this all together, if we accept that life is a literal physical extension of the planet, that together Earth and life form a single tightly coupled system, and that this planetary system exhibits many features of life, including anatomy, physiology, evolution, and perhaps most importantly, self regulation and astonishing resilience, having endured for more than 4 billion years, then we must recognize Earth itself as the largest known living entity. That doesn't mean that that Earth is a single living thing in exactly the same way as a bird or bacterium, nor that it's a superorganism akin to an ant colony, but rather that Earth is the largest known living system, the confluence of all other ecosystems, with structures, rhythms, and self-regulating processes that resemble those of its smaller constituent life forms. Life may not be identical in all its manifestations, but it echoes, it rhymes at every scale. So Earth may not be a single giant organism, but it is alive. It's a vast, interconnected living system, suspended in the vacuum of space, eating starlight, breathing, pulsing, blooming, and continually defying the forces that would otherwise undo it. And that's exactly what we talk about when we talk about life. Now, one of the biggest criticisms of Lovelock's first book was that it was a bit thin. He wasn't exactly offering reams of evidence to support his bold claims. But so much science has happened in the nearly 50 years since he published that book. And we now have a much deeper understanding of the Earth system. So I wanted to talk through a few of the key examples of how Earth and life co-evolve and how the planet can regulate itself to an extent. So returning to this planetary thermostat, this hinges on a very special element, the element carbon. It's an extremely abundant element, an extremely gregarious element. It loves to form bonds with other elements. And carbon is the element on which all life is based, and it is the element of which vast portions of our planet is composed. And it is stored in various reservoirs spread throughout Earth, the atmosphere, the crust, the deep sea, and life itself. And carbon is continually cycling between these reservoirs. And where it is stored and in what proportions at any given time has a massive influence on global climate. But there is and so the key thing to keep in mind is that when there is a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, that is when the planet can heat up and enter an extreme hothouse state. And when there's a lot of carbon sequestered in the deep sea and crust, that is when the planet can freeze. But there's this stabilizing feedback loop built into the system that allows the planet to gradually stabilize its climate when it enters one of those extreme states. So if Earth enters in a torrential hothouse state, a combination of geological and biological processes that sequester and store carbon accelerate. And so they outpace volcanic activity. And that pulls carbon down from the atmosphere. And so the planet cools. Conversely, if the planet enters a deep freeze, those same geological and biological processes of carbon sequestration, they slow down significantly. So volcanic activity outpaces them. So carbon returns to and builds up in the atmosphere, and the planet heats up again. And that thermostat is really just one example of the many profound ways in which life is entwined with the planet's capacity to maintain a dynamic equilibrium. Another profound example is how life essentially created and maintained the Earth's modern atmosphere. Again, going back to ancient Earth, it likely had this hazy orange sky with essentially no free oxygen. Today, we have a glorious blue sky and 21% oxygen, and photosynthetic life is largely responsible for that shift. But the amount of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere has actually fluctuated dramatically throughout its history. If we go back some 300 million years, it was more like 30 to 35%. And back then, we had giant dragonflies the size of pigeons and millipedes as big as surfboards. And they were enjoying this oxygen rich environment that made it easier for them to breathe and fly. And that high level of oxygen also fueled megafires, unlike anything we've ever witnessed. But around 200 million years ago, and even more so in the past 50 million years, as you can see in the lower half of this chart, the level of oxygen in the atmosphere began to stabilize compared to the deep past. And it's hovered around that 21% for quite a while now. And scientists have long struggled to explain this equilibrium. But recently, they have converged on a possible answer, which is the co-evolution, the braided evolution of fire, life, and oxygen. And the basic idea is that the co-evolution of photosynthetic life, in particular land plants and fire, acts as a regulator on the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. Because when oxygen levels rise and fuel intense megafires, they burn down vast tracts of vegetation. And that weakens the very mechanism by which oxygen accumulates in the atmosphere. So oxygen levels come back down again. And that is an example of negative feedback or stabilizing feedback, which we see again and again in the Earth system. Similar things happen in the ocean. For example, if you sample deep sea water around the world, you will find exactly the same ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus in that water as you find in the cells of plankton themselves. And it turns out that is because plankton are essentially creating and maintaining that particular chemical ratio. Plankton have evolved these elaborate chemical recycling systems by which they take nitrogen and phosphorus into their cells, make them more biologically useful, and put new chemical forms of them out into the ocean again. And in doing so, they define modern ocean chemistry. And a similar process happens with nitrogen on land and terrestrial microbes. And in fact, all complex life depends on the chemical wizardry of these microscopic organisms making nitrogen more biologically useful. Plankton continually astonished me while reporting this book because they are so suffused throughout the Earth system and so amazing in their capacity to endure through the ages and to make massive changes. For example, if you were to chip a small piece of chalk off of the White Cliffs of Dover in the UK and examine it under a microscope, you would see something like the image on the right. You would see these discs and bows made of neatly packed together little peg-like structures that are sort of packed together almost like the stones in a stone archway. And that's because the White Cliffs of Dover are more than just rock. They're also a graveyard of ancient fossils, the fossilized skeletons of plankton that lived in the ocean more than 65 million years ago. And when those plankton died and sank to the sea floor, their chalky skeletons were compressed and subjected to immense pressure and heat and eventually petrified. They turned into stone, which was then exposed by falling sea level. And that is what the White Cliffs of Dover, this massive geologic formation, is. And in fact, the vast majority of chalk and limestone formations on our planet are made of the ancient remains of plankton and other sea creatures, which means that all of the monuments we have constructed with limestone, including Notre Dame and the Colosseum and the Empire State Building, are themselves made of plankton, and they are therefore secret monuments to ancient marine life. So how does our species fit into this new paradigm of Earth as a vast interconnected living system? Well, we are the latest chapter in a very long saga of life continually changing the planet. So in that respect, we're not any different. But we do stand out in a few ways, in the combined speed, scale, and diversity with which we have transformed Earth. No living species before us has changed so many layers of the planet in such a short span of time. We've commandeered half of the habitable land on this planet to grow crops and raise livestock. We've overfished and polluted the oceans, and we've pumped an immense volume of carbon into the atmosphere. Some scientists think this volume of carbon has never entered the atmosphere this quickly in Earth's entire 4.5 billion year history, which would make us both ecologically and geologically unique. And one way to think about this is through the concept of planetary boundaries. These are ecological ceilings on the amount of disruption the Earth system can tolerate before it becomes dangerously unstable and incapable of supporting the ecosystems on which we depend and therefore our way of life. Scientists have identified 9 such ceilings, such as ocean acidification and the depletion of the ozone layer, and we've already crossed 6 of those thresholds. I also think that Earth system science helps clarify for us exactly what we have been doing to the Earth system. Because we're used to, for example, thinking of fossil fuels in relatively clinical terms as convenient resources available to us. But that really obfuscates what they are. Fossil fuels are ancient life that has been compressed and cooked deep within the planet, and that would have remained there for millions of years had we not dug them up. Coal, for example, is largely made of ancient plants, ancient bogs and swamps. And oil, petroleum, is largely made of ancient plankton and marine creatures. And in fact, a single gallon of gasoline is equivalent to about 100 tons of ancient life, or approximately 20 adult elephants. So that starts to give you an idea of just how much ancient life we are using to keep our cars running, to power all the heating units on the planet, to feed into all the power stations that still use fossil fuels to create steam and generate electricity, which is the vast majority of them. So put all of that together and think about just how much ancient life we have unearthed and set on fire and then released those emissions to the atmosphere, shifting an immense amount of carbon from the deep crust to the atmosphere and warping that global carbon cycle we talked about, that deep time thermostat. So all of these emissions, not just carbon, but other forms of greenhouse gases as well, are thickening this insulating layer of heat-trapping gas that surrounds the planet. And that is rapidly increasing global temperature with all of the consequences that we are witnessing more and more every year. But this new way of thinking shows us that we've done more than simply raise average global temperature or harm the environment. What we've really done is to push the largest known living entity into a new crisis state, into a state of severe imbalance. And scientists sometimes think about this in terms of the landscape of risk. They think of Earth as a kind of marble continually rolling across this landscape of risk. And sometimes it reaches peaks where it has immense potential for rapid change. And sometimes it sinks into deep valleys and troughs where it gets stuck for a long time. And right now, we are pushing Earth towards a new deep valley, a new hothouse Earth state. And though it could technically roll itself out again, it would take an immense amount of time, energy, and effort to do so, tens of thousands to millions of years. And in the process, Earth would become a world unlike any we have ever known, incredibly tempestuous and dangerous and inhospitable, just not just to us, but to millions of other species that live with us on the planet today. And that is why it is so crucial that we not only intervene, but do so as rapidly as possible. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions? Well, there's many contributors, but the two giant buckets are industrial agriculture and food systems more generally, and fossil fuels and current energy infrastructure more generally. And if we don't reform those systems, we're not going to halt global warming. And there's really no way around that. But we're not restricted to slashing emissions. There's more that we can do. We can also learn to emulate and amplify the Earth's own self-regulating processes. And one of the best ways to do this is to conserve, preserve, and restore the very ecosystems that are already exquisitely adapted to storing large volumes of carbon. So on land, that would be forests, wetlands, and grasslands. And of course, there are many analogs in aquatic systems, like kelp forests, coral reefs, and seagrass meadows. Now, the scale of this challenge is obviously overwhelming and daunting, but massive systemic change is necessarily tied to smaller individual shifts. The two cannot be separated. And it is possible to make a difference on a smaller local scale as well. And my garden is my attempt to do that. It is the most direct and personal way in which I have engaged with this material. It is this small parcel of living earth over which I have some capacity to be a steward. And our garden has really taught me the value and benefit of reciprocity. I've come to see gardening itself as a form of co-evolution, not just with the other living organisms around us, but also with the sun and the rain and the soil. It's really this improvised, extemporaneous, collaborative performance with all the other animate and inanimate elements that make up the Earth system. And the more that I worked on both my garden and book, the more I came to see Earth itself as a kind of garden. And of course, the idea of the planet as a garden is one of the oldest metaphors on record, with many variations in many cultures and religions around the world. But I think that this modern understanding of Earth as a living system reframes this idea and metaphor in an important way. We're used to thinking, especially in Western culture, of Earth as a passive garden, either this preformed idyllic landscape available for humans to use, or a kind of wilderness that we have to come in and tame. But really, Earth is an extremely active garden. It's a garden that sowed itself, watered itself, nurtured itself, and through sentient species like us, eventually became aware of itself. It's a garden whose members all participate in its stewardship, whether consciously or not. It really shows us that Earth is this beautiful rebellion and at the same time a precarious miracle. It is a garden suspended in the void. And I'd like to close with a quote from one of my favorite writers, Virginia Woolf, whose work I return to frequently for inspiration. And while writing this book, I was astonished to rediscover this quote from her autobiographical writings. Woolf described what she called moments of being, in which the cotton wool that clouds everyday reality is suddenly pulled away, and she could perceive a deeper truth. And in this particular moment of being, she was looking at some flowers at her family's vacation home, and she suddenly realized that there was this ring enclosing the flowers and the earth, and that the real flower, as she put it, was part earth, part flower. And I really think that's the gist of it all. There's this ring enclosing all life and us with the planet. And although it is normally hidden, we can learn to bring it into glowing focus. And that is what I have been trying to do with this book. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you, Ferris. It's such a hopeful quote. I hope you'll leave it on the screen as we continue our discussion. It's been quite a time in national news, and I really appreciate you being here tonight to give us a sense of energy around our gardening and a sense that we really are participating and can be participating. And I felt that when I read the book, and I really feel it this evening. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And let's see, I know that we had a question. Um, someone asked when you started, excuse me, you talked a little bit, you showed pictures of your garden. And she said, can you describe why you had some fencing around some plots during your establishment phase?
Yeah, there were a few different reasons. In the very beginning, my partner and I did a lot of kind of preparation and planning. And Ryan had studied architecture and art at
Mm.
school. And so he drew up a lot of sort of plans and layouts of the garden from different perspectives. So we went out there with cardboard cutouts, so of where we wanted the eventual flagstone path to be in the pond, and we were sort of moving them around and trying different configurations. And we were also using fencing kind of as markers. And then later on, I would fence off different areas where I was trying to establish certain types of plants because we have a very high energy dog who loves to romp in the garden. And there were certain very tender plants that I wanted to protect. In particular, there's this interesting ground cover called Herniaria glabra. That's its scientific name. Doesn't have a wonderful common name. I think it's sometimes called green carpet or smooth rupture wort. I've seen it sold more frequently in local nurseries. And I ordered like one of these massive crates where you just get like 100 tiny, tiny strands of a ground cover. So there was no way they were going to stand up to a dog treading all over them. And there were other kind of, baby tender plants like that I would fence off in the very beginning just to help things get established.
And then someone, Claudia said, what is that ground cover near the house on the inside of the fencing and gate? Is that the plant you just mentioned?
Yes, that is
Ah,
Herniaria glabra.
okay.
It's a really good one. It does form a green carpet true to its name. It is fairly drought tolerant. We found that it will go brown if it's like in intense heat and dryness throughout the whole summer. But it has this incredible capacity to kind of sew itself back together again. So when there's a bare patch, I'll cut some of where it's kind of grown in excess and just transfer
Mhm.
it over to the bare patch in the rainy season, and it stitches itself back together. It also it has flowers, but they're so tiny that they don't attract bees. So it's a good one if anybody has like allergies to stinging insects, because it doesn't really attract them. But it does form a nice little sort of understory for insects and arthropods, so it is sort of helping wildlife, more than mowed turf grass would be. The
Mhm.
other ground cover I use a ton of is creeping thymes, which I'm sure many of us gardeners here use a lot of that, and they've just been so wonderful. They work so well in this climate, and I love to form these tapestries of different types of thymes. So I'll go for like the silver-leaved woolly ones, contrasted with some of the greener-leaved ones as well. And I like that combination.
Wonderful. A person, Alicia says, oh, and Shuju did put some links to that plant in the chat for people to click on if they want more information. A woman by the name of Alicia says, thank you so much, Ferris. That was a fabulous summary of life on and in, including Earth. In an hour, you covered what it takes me a year to touch the surface with middle schoolers. She said, I appreciate your transformation of your yard to living scape. How did you choose your plants? And will you be adding more local native plants as you move on?
Mhm. Yes, I made a lot of lists in the very beginning of the different types of plants I wanted to use, and I wanted to kind of balance natives with just kind of hardy flowering perennials that work well in this region, and also plants that I just personally find really beautiful and love. We decided after we discovered the quality of our soil that we needed to focus on natives and hardy drought tolerant perennials because we were not going to be installing giant sprinklers or like devoting huge amounts of water to this garden. So we needed plants that could really, stand up for themselves and really be resilient. But then there were certain areas that were shadier. So in those regions, I would put plants that we just love, like a couple peony bushes, or maybe some columbines or things that like a little bit more of the dappled environment. And then there's a few studies, including by the local Xerces Society, that have been really helpful because they've identified particular species that are really beneficial to local pollinators. So I remember some of them are that purple flowering aster that you'll see in a lot of Pacific Northwest gardens. I think that was the top rated one for pollinators. It attracts a huge diversity of pollinators. Yarrow was up there. I think California poppies were really popular as well. So those have all been brought into the garden in pretty large quantities. And then there's certain plants like I've always loved bellflowers, campanula, and there are a couple native campanulas here, but they're not the same kind that are usually sold as garden cultivars. But I found that the pollinators still like the garden cultivars, so I plant those as well. And then I'm honestly just constantly trying out new cultivars. Like, every spring and fall, we're always at the local nurseries, buying all kinds of stuff, just seeing kind of what works. And I also love when plants seed themselves and find their own microclimates. So, like, we have a massive boulder in the rock garden, and there's the north-facing side of it is the shadiest and wettest. And some native ferns and mosses have found that pocket and grown there on their own, which is just great. So some of the plants are coming in on as on their own as well.
I also will mention that Shusha put a link to your Instagram. Apparently you've posted a lot of pictures there. I'm definitely gonna check that out after this, because it really was fun to look at what you've done with that piece of property. Someone said, oh, excuse me, I went back to, I need to go back. I really love and feel part of this explanation of life. And then Jesse says, did you add compost to your front yard to get the wildflowers to grow, or did you just plant the wildflowers without adding compost? Did the wildflowers improve your soil by themselves?
Right. So for the wildflower meadow in the front, I did not use any compost. That was kind of my experiment to see what could grow in the soil as it was. And a lot of the plants that we call wildflowers, they have evolved to grow in nutrient poor, disturbed soils and to very rapidly grow big and then to spread a huge amount of seed for the next generation. So they are to some extent adapted to those conditions. Just adjacent to the wildflower meadow in the front, we have a shade garden in the shade of a Douglas fir. Over there, I removed some of the poor soil by hand and then trucked in some higher quality soil and compost. And that's where I've planted things like hellebores and brunnera, and toad lilies, and various native shade-loving ground covers, and all kinds of things. And that those plants do appreciate, a bit richer soil over there. I haven't actually tested the soil in the wildflower meadow because I was kind of relying on these plants that can grow in these sort of nutrient poor conditions. But it has definitely made the soil easier to work because I've started to mix in some pretty hardy perennials into the wildflower meadow. Things like sedums and globe thistle and sea hollies, and a bunch of other stuff. And so they have really been permeating the soil with their roots and changing its structure. And I also learned about this concept of bioturbation, which is how scientists talk about any organism that disturbs soil, that keeps soil moving. And plants can do this. Any plant that forms a thick taproot can create a very large macropore in soil. And things like California poppy, even if they are only around for a few seasons, they do form these large taproots quite quickly, so they can do some of that work as well.
Let's see. We are done with the questions that people have typed in, but I did have my own question. You talk a lot about perennials and of course flowers. Did you plant any trees?
Yes. Oh, and I think I also forgot to mention our raised beds in the back. So in the very
Oh,
back of
please
the
do.
garden, yeah, in the very back of the garden, we built some raised beds that are primarily for vegetables and herbs and berries. And we've tried a bunch of different things back there. We've got strawberries, blueberries, a strawberry guava, and we've grown corn, eggplants, tomatoes, squashes, all kinds of things. And then in the winter, what we do is we routinely sow winter cover crops, mostly legumes and grasses, so that the soil is never bare. And then we mow those into the soil. We mow them down into the soil, let them compost, decay in there on their own. And we have added some trees. To the rock garden, we put in an Arbequina olive, which is supposedly does particularly
Mm,
well in this climate. And then we have two espalier fruit trees, an apple tree with multiple varieties grafted onto one branch from Portland Nursery, and then a pie cherry tree, a tart cherry tree,
mm.
that we espaliate ourselves in sort of a fan shape. And then we also put in a crepe myrtle as sort of a fairly drought tolerant flowering tree. And then we have I believe it's called it's the one type of orange that can can sort of survive here. You have to sort of bring it to a warmer space for the winter, but it did
Mhm.
make our very first orange this year. It produced a sweet, delicious orange. It's still a baby orange tree in a pot, so we can move it around. But I think
Mhm.
those are our main trees in the back.
So all, it sounds like they were all edible, well, except for the crepe myrtle, they're edible
Exactly.
trees
Yep.
with edibles on them. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for visiting with us this evening. I encourage everybody who hasn't had a chance to pick up the book to pick up the book and read it. One last question. What are you working on next?
I am currently working on a series of magazine pieces. I write a lot for the New York Times Magazine. I'm doing some
Hmm.
more climate change writing for them. And I'm definitely thinking about new book ideas. This one was quite a journey. It was like 6+ years to finish, so it might be a while. But the paperback version of this book, Becoming Earth, is out in April. And that one will be only $20, so significantly more affordable and a bit smaller, more manageable. And I will be doing a series of Portland talks and events in April and throughout the spring. And that's all on my website as well.
I noticed you changed the subtitle of the book
Yes,
from the hardback to the paperback.
yes, it's fairly common for publishers to sort of refresh both the cover and the subtitle just to sort of
Hmm.
distinguish the paperback from the hardcover a little bit.
Well, that answers that question, which was why. Thank you again for your time, and thanks all of you for attending, and we'll see you back here in March.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
you.